My topic, I'm going to make this in two parts. It's also better for the video to have the video not too long. So it'll be in two parts. Part number one, I want to talk about statistics. The statistics I'm going to bring are more or less exact, and that's on purpose because I don't want to go into too great detail or else we'll lose the whole picture. So first I'm going to talk about the various immigrations to Israel since the middle of the 19th century until 2020. Okay, immigrations to Israel, what we call in Ivrit, aliyot. Aliyot is in the plural, aliyah is in the singular. Aliyah means to go up. First of all, there was the idea that Israel is on the mountains, Jerusalem is on the mountains. So when you go up to Jerusalem, right, Rome was built on a few mountains, Jerusalem was built on many mountains. So Yerushalayim Harim Savivla, it says in the Psalms that Jerusalem is a city with many mountains around it. So it says, Jerusalem is surrounded by mountains and God surrounds his people forever. That's what King David says in the Psalms. So in the Psalms of Ascent. So I want to talk a little bit about the aliyot. From the aliyot, I want to talk about the groups in Israel. I will call them ethnic groups, even though the majority of them are Jewish. But one of the, I think, something which stands out in Jewish history about the state of Israel, and I think it's quite peculiar to the state of Israel, is the amount of different types of Jews that you have in the same country. So let me give you an example. Jews living in England are mostly what we call Ashkenazic Jews, who can trace their ancestry, let's say the ancestry in the last 100 years to Eastern and Central Europe, and their ancestry to 1,000 years to France and Germany. And before that, of course, the land of Israel before the Romans destroyed our temple. And that was more or less the Jews in England. There are some Sephardic Jews in England, maybe people who ran away from Spain and went through Holland, etc., but not a lot. The Jews of France, before the war, they were all Ashkenazic Jews. Same story as the English Jews. After the war, there was an influx of Jews from Algeria, and some came even from Israel. And this changed, of course, the demography. But the point is that most of the countries where Jews live outside of Israel, there are one or two Jewish groups, and that's it. Very often the Jews are more or less from the same place. Like when I grew up in Montreal, we had Ashkenazic Jews and we had Sephardic Jews. Almost all the Ashkenazic Jews were from Russia and Lithuania and a few from Hungary and Romania. Almost all the Sephardic Jews came from Morocco. They came like as one, more or less one group. So that's usually the way it is outside of Israel. If there's usually most of the Jews in a certain city or in a certain country are from one place, and sometimes from another place, but that's it. Not from 50 countries. In Israel, you have Jews from at least 50 countries, which means 50 different cultures. Because even if our religion is Jewish, and if you want to say our ethnicity in a sense, and I have to say only in a sense, is Jewish, because the culture is going to override the ethnicity to a great extent. I always said, actually, the best way to define Jews is not as an ethnicity or a religion, but more like a family. Now, a family has certain beliefs. And how do you enter a family? You're either born into a family or you marry into a family. So that's the way I see being Jewish. We're not exactly an ethnicity in the sense that, I mean, yes, you have races of people, but we take people in all the time over the generations. It's true that people who live in post-communist countries tend to see Jews more as ethnicities because religion had disappeared in most communist countries for 2 generations. In Romania, there still was the church. I don't know how active it was. You could tell me, I just don't know. It was quite active. Okay, but other places like Russia, for instance, in most of the Soviet Union, I mean, religion was almost taboo. So Jews were only seen as an ethnicity because there was no religion to be practiced during those times. So that's why I like saying it's a belief together with the peoplehood, but the peoplehood it works like a family, and you're either born into it, and then even if you don't believe, your brother's your brother, your sister's your sister. You're not going to throw them out of the family. And on the other hand, if somebody joins the family and wants to accept the beliefs of the family and get along with everybody, that's also okay. That's exactly the way we look at it. If you know that there's a book called Amos, the prophet Amos, chapter 3, he says, "Rak etchem yadati mikol mishpachot ha'adama." Only you have I known from all the families of the earth. Have I known, yadati. In other words, the prophet says in the name of God, only you have I known from all the families of the earth. That's one of the few places in the Bible the Jewish people is called a family, which is an interesting way of looking at it. And I think there is something to be said about that. Yeah. Talking about religious families? I'm talking about a family that has a belief system. And we have a very specific belief system. If you want to find it out, there's lots and lots of books about what Judaism is. But we're also a family that went through experiences together over many, many centuries. So we're both. There's a lot of history. It's easy to write when you write the history of the Jewish people, you're writing the history of half the world because of all the countries we went through. It's just, I mean, de facto, that's the way, except for maybe China. Yes. But you never know what's going to happen in the future. So, history is not over yet. So maybe they're going to play an important role. I don't actually know. But that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is just as an example. When I grew up as a child in Montreal, in Canada, so most of the Jews were Ashkenaz, meaning they came from, as I said, in the particular case of Montreal, they came from Russia, Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, more or less. Toronto, for instance, was also Ashkenazic Jews, mostly from Poland. A slightly different immigration even came at a slightly different time. When the Moroccan Jews came to Montreal in the 1950s, some directly from Morocco, 50s and 60s, and some of them through Israel, meaning they came to Israel, whatever. What happened was with the Moroccan aliyot to Israel, which was in the 50s and 60s, you had the rich ones didn't go to Israel. They went to France, they went to Canada, and a few other places. Because they had money, and when people have money, they choose where they want to go. When you don't have money, you don't choose. If you're expelled from a country, you go wherever takes you in. Because, if you remember with the rise of the state of Israel, the Jews were expelled from all the Arab countries. I should say from all the Muslim and Arab countries in the Middle East. And so they had to go where they would be accepted. So, of course, the state of Israel accepted them. And therefore, we got a lot of them, we'll see on the list in a moment. But there are others who had money and they went. There were Jews from Egypt. We have Jews from Egypt in Montreal who lived at the same time, from very wealthy families in Alexandria or Cairo. One guy whose family was in the water industry, creating pipes and irrigation. And so they had quite a lot of money in Egypt. Had to leave. What can you do? But I'm just saying that when the Moroccan Jews came to Montreal in the 50s and 60s, for at least 30 years, there was very little intermingling between Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews for a number of reasons. Number one, they spoke different languages. The Ashkenazic Jews all spoke English. The Moroccan Jews all spoke French. They were educated in Morocco and in French-speaking schools. And France, of course, during the war, up to them, was in charge there. Secondly, the minhagim, the customs were different. So it's the same Judaism, but there were some customs were different. Cuisine was totally different. It's the Middle Eastern cuisine and the Ashkenazi cuisine, and they live in a different part of town. So I would say the 20 to 30 years it took for the barriers to come down. Today, they're totally down. But I'm just saying it took a long time for these two parts of the community to actually recognize each other and get together. So now think in the state of Israel, you have 50 different countries, and some of them are vastly, vastly different in their thinking. I mean, try to put together in the same room, a Yemenite Jew, an Iraqi Jew. By the way, Iraqis and Moroccans don't get along, by the way. No, I'm just saying very seriously that, it sounds funny to us, right? You guys are all Middle Eastern. It doesn't work like that. You know that Polish and German Jews never got along. And they have a border, don't they? Polish and German Jews. The Jews in Germany consider the Polish Jews what we call in years the Ois, those guys from the East. Excuse me, Jews in Hungary look down at Jews in Transylvania. There were also those Eastern Jews, hillbillies living in little farms. Yeah. It's not just among Jews. The Western Germans look down on the Eastern Germans who are under communism. They're backwards. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm just saying, yeah. So even among Jews, it was like that. So what? People are the same everywhere with the same prejudices, with the same mistakes. We know how to make mistakes, and we do it all the time. So, and so I'm just saying that if you have already these tensions, putting everybody together in the same pot was really something. It's a miracle that Israel was able to stay united with such throwing everybody together in the melting pot. It's one thing when the melting pot is a non-Jewish country. If you have the United States, and the ideology of the United States for many, many years was the melting pot ideology. We're taking people from many countries, but they've got to be American. You're going to learn to eat pizza, you're going to watch baseball, okay? And you're going to sing the national anthem with the flag and eat hot dogs, okay? That's what you're expected to do in the United States. Not every country is like that. Britain for many years had the same idea. You can come from anywhere. Where Britain was a protectorate, because there were many countries. Remember, the sun never set over the British Empire, they used to say. So whatever country, however, you have to put up the flag, you have to say hurrah when the Queen comes by. There's certain things you have to do, and then everybody accepts you and learn Queen's English, not the accent. Okay, you want to get an accent from South London, that's something else. But it can't be a foreign accent, it's got to be, right? So that's it. If you have a perfect, English, they more, and you like beer, so everybody is okay. So I'm just saying that what Israel did really was phenomenal. I think it was against all odds to take in people from so many countries, and it should actually work. You know that in years ago, in an interview with the head of the Palestinian Authority, so the president. So he once said that he thought, he's not a young man, he's in his 80s. He said he thought when he first got involved in this in the 1970s, that the Jews who came from Arab lands would be closer to the Arabs living in Israel than the Jews, because they came from the same culture. Okay? I'm talking about Mahmoud Abbas, right? I mean, he really thought that. And actually, I can understand why he thought that. They speak Arabic. They live in our culture for generations. Okay, they've got co-religionists, but we also have co-religionists in Turkey, and we have nothing in common with them. Like the Muslims in Turkey and the Muslims in Syria, they have nothing in common. The Muslims in Kazakhstan and the Muslims living in Egypt have nothing in common. So he assumed that the Jews who came from Arab lands would have more in common with the Arabs than. And he said he was very surprised to see that was not the case. Because even though in the Islam they do have the concept of the Ummah, the Islamic nation, Jews actually traditional Jews believe in the unity of the Jewish people. It's like an idea that you are taught. And the more the traditional Jew, the more they believe that. And the Jews who came from the Arab countries were very traditional. So they believed it. And that's why it worked. It's Jews who actually move away from their traditions who have less of a belief of the Jew in the unity of the Jewish people. Because what for? Unless you're taught it as a goal, as an ideal, this is a problem by itself. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that the very fact that you have Jews coming from so many countries into Israel, even though this was the dream, the goal of Zionism, of immigration of Jews from different countries, it presented a very intense issue. How do you get a society to get along that way? And it's not by mistake that these various groups lived in their own little neighborhoods and communities. Whether it was a whole moshav, when you come to Jerusalem, there's what they call the neck to Jerusalem, Prosdor Yerushalayim. It's like an entrance to Jerusalem. You have many, many settlements there of Jews from India and Cochin because they wanted to be around their friends. You went to Netanya originally, and everybody was from Tripoli, from Libya. You go to Ashdod, and everybody's from Morocco. Half of Beersheba, everybody's from Morocco. And Netivot, what? Later on, the French started coming. Also, North African French, by the way. There was North, but I'm just saying, and they had relatives. But I'm just saying, and they liked the beach. They came from Marseille. You had a beach, so you have to go another beach. So, but I'm just saying, and also you had Russians who came to Netanya because it was affordable because they had relatives, or who went to Beersheba because it was affordable, or Bat Yam was affordable. Cholon was now it isn't, but it was then. So I'm just saying that people tend to live even you're in Jerusalem, you have different neighborhoods, different people. You have religious Zionist neighborhoods, you have Haredi neighborhoods, you have Sephardic neighborhoods, less so, but like the Bukhara section, etc. You even have Haredi Mizrahi, as we say, which is Sephardic Haredi who live in their own areas, and Ashkenazi Haredi. The people are very tribal in the country because they came from what I would call tribes. You'll have a Bukhari Jew, and they'll tell their children you can marry anybody as long as they're Bukhari Jew. So, and by the way, you'll hear this even from secular Bukhari Jews. It's not about religion; it's about ethnicity. I've seen this a lot. Okay, so that was the first thing I wanted to mention. Now I want to show you some statistics. And can you see this, or you're not? You're probably not seeing it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll just mention it. But if you, the question was whether to put it here, but here at least it'll be in perpetuity because
I will take a picture and send to the girls in the room.
Okay, there's more than just this though. It starts over. It starts here. These are there are two parts to it. The aliyot to Israel, immigration to Israel from 1850. Oh, by email right now? Okay, I didn't think of that. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, hold on. Okay, we'll do that. Yeah. I worked on this afternoon. It was either that or falling asleep, so. Okay, let's see. How do I do this? How do I do this? Sorry, send. Send. Okay. Give it this mind. Let's stop this for a second. But because I have the zoom on, it goes very slowly. It'll eventually happen. Okay. I'll go to Israel, documents. Here it is. Okay, let's hope it worked. Okay, I sent it. Hopefully it'll go. Takes like a little bit of time, but hopefully it'll. Okay, I think it went. Okay, dear friends, so let's go back to this. I will do it share. You'll be able to see this, and you'll see what I'm. Hopefully, we'll get to the point. First, I want to go over just um, some of the statistics. I start off in 1850. In 1850, Jerusalem had 8,000 people. 4,000 of them were Jews, meaning Jews were already the majority of the city because you have Christians and Muslims in the other 4,000 in 1850. Other populated cities, I'm sorry for the misspell, populated cities. Other populated cities were Safed, Acre, Hebron, Jaffa, and even Gaza, actually. So, whatever. That's just in general, meaning there were Jews, there were thousands of Jews already living in Israel in the middle of the 1900s, but I want to go forward. I want to start from what we call the first aliyah. It's slightly arbitrary, but let's say it's the first aliyah of the political Zionist movements. First one being Chibat Zion, the Russian Zionist movement, founded, actually, as you know, the first meeting of the Chibat Zion Lovers of Zionist movement was actually here in Romania, in Focșani, somewhere around the 1871, I think it was. And then the second was in Katowice in Poland, somewhere around 1890, something like that. And then after that, you have Herzlian Zionism with its first Congress in 1897, which is a more secular Zionist movement than the Chibat Zion, which was sort of traditionalist, I would say. Okay, 1882, the first Aliyah, Chibat Zion, 2,500 immigrants come to Israel, set up little towns, Rishon LeZion, for those who know the names, Zichron Yaakov, Petach Tikva, even some of the areas in Jerusalem like Nachalat Shiva are set up in this time. It's also a traditionalist group. 1904 to 1914 is the second Aliyah, and this is an Aliyah which is already, people are members of the Herzlian Zionist point of view. Also, what is very, what I would say is indicative of these aliyot, the first, the second, and the third aliyah, and even the fourth aliyah. The first four aliyot are all ideological. These are people who know they're going to a place which is not, you're not going to become wealthy. And you're going to have to work hard, and there's going to be disease and hard labor. So these are very ideological aliyot to Israel, what we call pure Zionism. You're doing it out of the ideal, coming back to the land, building it up. Okay, let me keep going. 1904 to 1914 is the second aliyah. What is very characteristic of the second aliyah is that they are socialist. Remember, they come from Russia, some from Poland, and socialism is now the name of the day. By 1914, there's going to be, of course, the Russian Revolution, which will have finished by 1917, and then Russia will be the communist Soviet Union. So the Jews were very taken by communism because the communists promised that would be the end of anti-Semitism because we are all comrades and we are equal under the law. And of course, Jews are naive, and whenever you tell them something they want to hear, they believe it. And they'll be the first ones. I've always said the only ones who actually believed in communism in Soviet Russia were probably the Jews. I don't actually believe that the other people believed in it. They had to because it was, you wanted to be in government. Lenin, for instance. Okay, maybe Lenin did. Trotsky definitely did. But Stalin, I doubt it. You know that Trotsky, who was the second in command in the Soviet Union, who was a Jewish guy, Leon Trotsky, he was in charge. He built up the Red Army from nothing. Okay, he was the man who built up the Red Army. He was in charge of the army. That was the absolute power of the country. He could have done anything he wanted to. Instead, he saw this little clerk, Shvili, right, who changed his name to Stalin, go up the levels of the Communist Party, and he did absolutely nothing to stop it. And eventually, Stalin, who knew what Trotsky could do and didn't understand why he didn't do it, he was very paranoid, very afraid of him. Eventually, he banished Trotsky, went off to live in South America. And even that wasn't enough. He sent people to kill him. You know, there was a meeting with heads of the state of Israel before the state happened, asking Trotsky if he would come to Israel and help them build up the army, the man who built up the Red Army. He said, I cannot, because I am a communist and I believe in universality. It doesn't make sense for me to just work on one country of Jews. I mean, he actually believed in these things, so despite the fact that he was killed by Stalin, and then they made him to a demon in Soviet Russia. They demonized him, just like they did here, Anna Balker. So actually, I have a friend in Israel who's related to her. But I know very little about her, but I know that she was demonized here. Okay, let me continue. So why do I stop here when I talk about 1882 to 1904 to 1914? As the people who were involved in the second Aliyah became extremely involved in setting up what we call the Jewish Agency. And the Jewish Agency eventually is going to become the government of the state of Israel. Names like David Ben-Gurion and Aleph Dalet Gordon, another ideologue of the Labor Party, and Brenner, who was actually killed by Arabs. And even not from that group, Rabbi Cook is also makes Aliyah during this time, Abraham Isaac Cook, and Agnon is, I mean, just you have lots and lots of names of ideologues and people who eventually are going to play a very important part of the state. Basically, all the people who didn't leave Israel after making Aliyah and the second Aliyah will be playing important roles in the army and then eventually in the government, because it was extremely ideological, and yeah. So 1919, 1923, it's the third Aliyah from Russia, Poland, Lithuania, and Romania. But in that order of Romania, about 5% of that Aliyah, Lithuania about 3%, the majority were Russian and Poland. That's called the third Aliyah. Again, it's a ideological Aliyah. 1924 to 1931 is called the fourth Aliyah, again ideological, again from Eastern Europe, but also Yemenite Jews and Iraqi Jews. But by the way, even though 80,000 people made Aliyah from 1921 to 1931, in the same years, 20,000 people left from previous immigrations. It was not easy living here. It is better to have loved and lost than not to have loved at all. So, you can't blame people for not liking to hang around when there's malaria and there's the plague. You know, I don't blame people. They at least tried and went wherever they went. So these are four ideological aliyot, and anybody who stayed from this time period is going to play a very big role eventually in the state of Israel. Another thing you can see about these early aliyot, and I'm not talking about the people who already lived in Israel in what we call the old settlement, the old yishuv, which were predominantly traditional Jews. Because in the 19th century, most of the people who were living in Israel before these aliyot were all religious and very religious, because that's why you came to Israel, because you're religious. I had an uncle who was totally secular. When he came to Israel, he didn't understand how come there's secular Jews in Israel, because in his mind, it's the holy country. If you want to be secular, live in Canada. It's like he didn't get it, you know. But I can understand that. Like if you don't know the history of Israel, it makes a lot of sense, you know, because from his point of view. Because of his point of view, I'm not religious. I don't live in Israel. So from 1932, all the aliyot will now become non-ideological. They will become Jews running away from somewhere, refugees. And this is really a miraculous story, that from 1932 till today, the vast majority of people come to Israel are Jewish refugees. Why do I call it miraculous? Because actually, I mean, as a believing Jew, I believe it was like a divine plan, because we would have never had a country if we didn't have people. And if you didn't have people running away from somewhere, chances of actually having a country just based on ideology were very slim. How can you have a country with 100,000 people? Okay, if you're Qatar and you have a lot of money and everybody else is just working for you, or Dubai, you don't need more than 100,000 people. But unfortunately, we didn't have oil fields, or else, yes, we could have done. But normally, when you have a country, you need a few million people. Who is going to come to the Middle East to sand dunes? Okay, so you had 4 aliyot, but look how many people you had in all the first 4 ideological aliyot. It doesn't hit 100,000. There were 100,000 people living in Israel, including all the very religious people who were there before, who came to Israel because they wanted to be in the Holy Land. But I mean, the ones who believed in practically setting up the state, it wasn't 100,000. In 1921, Chaim Weizmann, who eventually will be the first president of the country, together with the Rebbe of Bur, one of the Hasidic groups from Poland, sent out a letter asking Jews to make Aliyah. Nobody replied. Okay. It didn't matter that they banded together. So it didn't have, as you can see, look, 1921, it didn't have a very big effect. I just want to point that out. Let me continue. And now this is really a fascinating story, because this is where all of a sudden you have all these Jewish communities from all these countries of Jews who knew about each other, but most of the time didn't even talk to each other. The first one is obvious, 1932 to 1939, the fifth Aliyah from Germany. It's called the fifth Aliyah. They just call it that. 250,000 German Jews. I think last time I told you the story about Chaim Arlozorov, who was instrumental in bringing 50,000 German Jews to Israel in a deal that he made with Goebbels in like 1931, before even the Nazis came to power, but they were still quite involved in Germany in the political form. Crazy story, and then he was assassinated. But eventually, 250,000 Jews are able to escape Germany previous to the war. Some of them after Kristallnacht, and many of them come to Israel. 250,000. There were about 500,000 Jews in Germany prior to the war.
But how many Jews were allowed by English people, English Slovenians, to enter the country?
You're right. You did have what was called the white papers, 3 times where they limited the amount of Jews. I don't remember the numbers, but that created a big problem after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, because you had all these Jews who wanted to come to Israel, and the British said no, and put them in Cyprus in detention camps, which eventually created a lot of international outcry. And then eventually the British just gave in and said, okay, we're leaving. That's aside from things that were happening here, but I'm just saying it was part of it. They just had enough. So 32 to 39, obviously these were let in, these 250,000. 39 to 48, this includes the war years and the years after the war until the establishment of the state. So you have 130,000 Jews who are able to make it to Israel, and that's including what we call the illegal immigration to Israel from 45 to 48, where the British considered it illegal because of the white papers. However, 1949, there's an aliyah from Yemen, 50,000 Jews. 50 to 51, an aliyah from, the term aliyah, immigration from Iraq. That was the year of the Frahud. We're already starting to talk about these are going to be Arab countries or Muslim countries which kick Jews out of the Middle East. The idea was to flood the small state of Israel with as many people as possible so it would collapse economically. That was the Arab strategy. But it turned on its head, because what really happened was we actually got people, because Israel would have not been able to exist without a population. So even though the Arabs wanted to really drown Israel economically, because the country had very little money, in the end, you had people who were Zionists, because the vast majority of the Jews who lived in the Arab countries in the Middle East were traditional Jews who prayed to come to Jerusalem 3 times a day. So they had, even if they didn't choose to come to Israel, they still believed in it. So Yemen, 50,000, Iraq, who were literally kicked out in a pogrom called the Farhud, 1950, 1951. If you take these two aliyot together, Yemen, Iraq, and the people who came from Europe post the Shoah during the same years until 1951, altogether it's 687,000. So you can see how many were from, we were talking about 600,000 just from Shoah, who basically decided there's no place to go, let's go to Israel. It's not that they didn't have Shoah survivors going all over the globe. You did. You know the famous story. This guy says to his friend, okay, nice meeting, I'm going. He says, where are you going to go? He says, I'm going to Australia. He says, Australia? Why so far? He says, far from what? Right after the Shoah, there's no what. You know, there's a famous story that Rabbi Israel Meir Lau, who was the chief rabbi of Israel and now is the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. So he wrote a book about how his brother, Naphtali, really saved him, watched over him from the time they were born in Poland until the end of the Shoah. And he told one time a story. He said that his brother said, if we ever get split up, just go to Palestine, Israel. He said, why should I go there? He says, because there they don't kill Jews. That's what I remember from his old. Yeah. I know, but that's the way he told it. That's it, yeah. So this is a very big number, 687,000. I mean, by 1948, by the way, there are now over 600, by 1948, there are over 600,000 Jews living in British Mandate Palestine. However, already Jordan was set up as a country, and Jordan was already given half of Palestine. So there was actually more than 1 million Arabs at the same time who were living under the British Mandate, about 1,200,000. But since half of them went to the Jordanian side, there were actually 600,000 Jews and 600,000 Arabs living in what eventually becomes the state of Israel in 1948. It was supposed to be smaller because the partition plan of the 29th of November, 1947 was to partition the eastern side of the western side, the western side of the Jordan, which was not part of Jordan, meaning you had Transjordan, and then and the western side. By the way, the West Bank is actually the east bank of Israel, but it's the West Bank of Jordan. So so it's just interesting. They had 600,000 Jews and 600,000 Arabs, more or less equaled out at that time. Okay, let's continue. 400,000 for North Africa, which includes, I put here a list, but altogether for North Africa, 400,000. That's Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, and I think even Egypt. That's in 48 to 53. 1956 to 1958, the communist Polish government decides to expel its Jews, and the best way to do it is to say they're Zionists. So they said, Israel, would you like our Jews? They said, yes. Okay, we're going to help out.
Bring them here.
You bring them here. So 50,000 Jews come from Poland. Now, why is this very significant? This is the first, now since 1932, these are all aliyot, which are refugees. Here, these are also refugees because they're kicked out of the country. The difference is that the refugees, until this point, aside from the Shoah survivors, which were a whole hodgepodge of different types of people, but these were basically secular Jews who decided to remain in Poland after the war, despite the fact that there was nothing Jewish left, more or less. They're basically secular Jews. And many of them intermarried with Poles. So for them, it was because everybody else was going, they went too. But for them, it was a bit of a culture shock, because traditional Jews also had a culture shock coming to Israel, but they had a reason for being there.
Why a culture shock?
Because if you're a secular Jew, you'd really rather be in England than in Israel, but that wasn't an option. So now the question is, how do you deal with it? And then you walk on the street and you might see that there are things closed on the Sabbath. Why? It's not, we're talking about people who have no real connection. They just happen to be born into Jewish families, if that. This was the first aliyah, by the way, one from 56 to 58, where you had a significant amount of non-Jewish partners as part of the aliyah to Israel. And this can only happen when you are expelled from somewhere. I can tell you, when Jews make aliyah from the United States or Canada or England or France, there are some intermarried couples, but they're very small amount, because those are the people who usually don't come to Israel because they feel more comfortable in the place that they're living. You know, it makes sense. If a Jew marries a non-Jewish Italian woman, they're both going to feel more comfortable in Italy. If they come to Israel, he's got to explain why his wife is not Jewish, because Israelis, even if they're secular, they are very tribal. Okay. Oh, you're not Jewish. How'd that happen? Okay. Hello, most of the world isn't. Oh, yeah, that's true. But why are you in Israel? You know, Israelis are very, very nosy. It's all this tribal shtetl mentality, and it has nothing to do with that part. Has nothing to do with religion. So yeah. And how much money did you make until you got here? I see. Okay. Where are you living? How old are you? I have a son. Okay. It's like that. You know, that's Israel. Okay. So let's see. So that's why 56 to 58 is a watershed moment, because it was known by the government that this aliyah was going to be a different style. Remember, people coming after the Shoah, it didn't matter if they were secular or not, they were really grateful for Israel to take them in. They could have been 100% secular and gone to the church every Sunday, but they were very grateful for Israel taking them in. The ones who were kicked out of Poland really wanted to remain in Poland. That's the reason why they didn't leave after the Shoah. So it was a different type. They would have to now acculturate. And we'll talk about this more, because this is going to be an identity issue in Israel eventually. In my opinion, it starts exactly from that point. Okay, let's keep going. 58 to 60, the aliyah from Romania and Algeria, 75,000. Out of the 75,000, most are from Romania, about 40,000. Then you have, there's also significant, when does Ceausescu become in charge of the government here? What year is it? Okay, so this is an earlier time, yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Under him, yeah. We'll have Aliyah during the 70s, and that was an under Begin, they paid per capita for every person, which was money well spent, in my opinion, instead of wasting it on.
They sold some.
No. In Romania also not at this time.
It was not the case.
It wasn't 58 to 60 wasn't. That was later. Yeah. Okay. Then in the 1969 to 73, you have another interesting thing, the Aliyah from the Soviet Union, 150,000 Jews. Now this is interesting because in those days it's still communist. And for a Jew to make Aliyah in the early 1970s, there was a price to be paid. Meaning there was negotiations, the Soviet Union allowed it, but you would lose your job immediately and you had to wait for months to see if you would be on the list of those who could go. So it means you would live without a job in poverty, and then maybe you would be sent to Israel. So out of these 150,000 people, the vast majority of them were ideological because they knew that they were taking a big risk. So this is an ideological aliyah from the former Soviet Union, which at the time was. And even though there was some intermarriage at the time, these were people who wanted to be in Israel. They didn't want to be in Russia anymore. 1984 and 1981, these are the two aliyot from Ethiopia, 35,000 people. One is called the Aliyah of Solomon, and what is it called? Of Moshe. Then 1991 to 2000, we have another watershed movement. It's the Aliyah from the former Soviet Union. After the fall of communism, okay, you have eventually 980,000 people, almost 1 million people from 1991 to 2000. It actually doesn't stop in 2000. And at the same time, another 25,000 from Ethiopia, which were relatives of the first ones who came. This is an issue by itself. How long do you take relatives? Where does it stop? I don't want to discuss that now, but it's a very interesting topic because all the relatives who are coming since then must convert because they're actually practicing Christians. So if they want to be in Israel, they must convert. It's an interesting thing because never in the history of Israel did they ever ask any group to convert. But what happened was, this was the deal. They were not the original Beit Yisrael, which was the original Ethiopian Jews. They were only relatives of, and therefore they were told that if you want to come, not a problem, but you have to convert, and they agreed. Yeah. There's a story not a lot of people in Israel know. Okay, 1990 to 2009. Now starts what I call the hodgepodge of Aliyah from many countries. South America, 40,000. If you remember Argentina, the economy almost collapsed. The government was falling apart. Many Jews made Aliyah from South America at the time. Canada, 50,000. Most of these places, it's ideological, even when there are economic issues, because these are places that you can go to another country easily. Canada, the UK, France, and again, Ethiopia. Look how many come from Ethiopia now again, 50,000. Right. So, so basically what I'm saying, again, you have there's also some ideological aliyah that's happening at the same time, because there always will be traditional Jews who want to be in the land of Israel and are willing to pay the price. The price is making less money, being an outsider, even if you are Jewish, you don't have 100 relatives in Israel, and relatives is power in Israel.
The network.
It's the network. In Israel, they say, that we have a term, it's called protectia. Protectia? Is that they say that here too? So in Israel, we always say, you don't need protectia, you just have to know the right people. But you know what? I discovered also that in Israel, there's a network of Romanians too. So if you know the Romanians, that helps you. Yeah, more the previous generation, but it still exists to it. More the previous generation. Okay. Stopping. That was 2009. By the way, today in Israel there are 9.7 million people. Out of 9.7 million people, there are about 78% are Jews.
78?
About 78% are Jews. About 18 to 19% are Arab. And then you have about the 2 to 3%, which is other. Especially since the Aliyah from the former Soviet Union, you have quite a few others. The actual amount of Jews these are just interesting things. The actual amount of Jews who made Aliyah from the former Soviet Union since 1989 was 1.4 million. These were just during the years I mentioned before, 91 to 2000. It continued into the 2000s. However, at least 400,000 of them left.
No.
No, the ones who went back, there were some who went back. Those are the ones who were good in business and went back for opportunities. You had more than 100,000 people with Israeli ID cards living in Moscow before the war, before this war. More than 100,000. These people went back, found opportunities, were doing very well, and a lot of them sent their children back to Israel, and these children don't need help from the government. They're doing fine. Yeah. A friend of mine who was in an Opan in Israel met a few of these people making aliyah from Russia at the time, and their parents bought them an apartment, so they didn't have a problem in Jerusalem. Okay, so what I'm just saying, so no, some of them went to Germany, some of them went to the United States, some went to Canada. Because again, if you,
They like to travel.
but it's not just that. Let's think for a second. If you did not come from a traditional family which taught you about the land of Israel, you're just trying to get away. That's really what it was. So you're really hoping to use it as stepping stone to go somewhere else. If Germany will take you, hey, I feel better in Germany because I don't understand this Jewish business. Even if both parents were Jewish, they don't understand the Jewish business. It depends. Some of the families, yes. Some of the families who went, well, let's say they lived in the Ukraine where the Jews were more traditionally minded. Definitely Bukharan Jews are very traditionally minded. That's the areas of Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, places like that, what we call Sephardic, and some of them are Sephardic Jews too. So those Jews are really more traditionally minded. It's easier for them in Israel. Sarit Haddad, the Israeli singer, is also from the Kafkaz, also a traditional family. And so those people had an easier time in Israel. What?
Where are they settled?
Well, the Russian Jews are all over the country. I mean, it's a lot of people all over. But you can tell if somebody is a Bukhari Jew. They're usually more traditional. Georgian Jews are also more traditional, Georgia. And as I said, from the Kafkaz, the areas of the Caucasian Mountains are more traditional Jews, and like Azeris, Azerbaijan, Baku. So these are very, some of them actually speak Persian because they're on the border with Iran. So these are more traditional. So many of them are, but look, I don't want to say what people are. They're traditional. Let me put it that way. Some of them are Orthodox, yes, of course. And some of them remain in their traditions. They didn't have so much reform in these places. Usually Orthodox was sort of a reaction to reform, and they didn't have reform. So it was a little bit different. Okay, now what I'm gonna do, look what we have here. I'll just say, we have here Jews, different countries. Is there a more clear performance? Well, let's look at the countries where they're from. Make this easy. You have, first of all, Ashkenazi Jews. And let's call it, sometimes we use the term Sephardi, but really, it to be Eastern, like Eastern, they use the term. The term makes absolutely no sense because, for instance, they just understand the Moroccans in the West. In fact, the Moroccan Jews refer them to themselves as Bukhrabi, which in Arabic means Westerners, because they were the Western part of North Africa. So of course they're Westerners, Bukhrabi. So, but we call them Mizrahim in Israel because not all these Jews have any relationship to Spain. The Jews of Iraq have no relationship to Spain. Jews of Persia, of Iran have no relationship to Spain. Yemenites have no relationship to Spain. You even have some North African Jews who were there simultaneously, their families during the time of the Berbers, they have no connection to Spain. So even though sometimes people say Sephardi, they really mean Mizrahi, meaning all those areas, whether the Middle East or Muslim countries, with Jews who are not only from Spain, but also from other countries who have sort of similar customs. As I said, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, and a few others. So, okay. But then you also have other ways of looking at it. You also have religious and secular. And that's also different identity. Because if you came on the second aliyah and you're the children and grandchildren of people on the second aliyah who are ideologically socialist, okay, it's true they did. Their parents, their grandparents came from religious homes, but they rebelled. So they were very proud of being Jewish. They were proud of being Zionist, but they were secular. And sometimes when you rebel, you do crazy things, like in the leftist kibbutz movement of Hashomer Tzayir, they used to purposely eat pork on Yom Kippur to make a statement. Okay, only when you're rebellious do you do things like that. If you're actually a secular Jew, you don't know when Yom Kippur is. Like, you know the story about somebody's walking in New York, and he sees this Jewish guy sitting in a restaurant on Yom Kippur. He says, Joe, what are you doing in a restaurant? It's Yom Kippur. He says, did you forget it's Yom Kippur today? He says, no. He says, did you forget you're not supposed to eat on Yom Kippur? He says, no. So, oh, I forgot I'm Jewish. That can only happen in a very secular. I remember one time I was asked to give a talk to this group of American Jews, 16 years old, on one of these summer tours, let's go Israel type of summer tours. Yeah. They meet at the airport, have no background at all. And I was asked what day Shabbat was. Because they don't know that Saturday is Shabbat. Okay, so you have Jews who don't know that Saturday is Shabbat. That's it. It's not, you have things like that.
Where?
In the United States. Look, my sister, who lives in New York City, was once invited to, it was some fundraiser for, I don't know what, some hospital or something, and they had this big dinner. And so she's sitting there and she ordered a kosher meal. It comes like, on the plane and in a package. And so the lady next to her, who's Jewish, says, how come your food looks different than mine? Says, well, I ordered a kosher meal. The lady who was from New York, she says to her, you mean there's still Jews who eat kosher? This is New York City that has 2 million Jews. It's not Omaha, Nebraska. If you know what I mean. That's the situation. That's the situation. It is usual. In my father's generation, where we used to the fact there were Jews who decided to be secular, but they knew that they were Jews. They knew a little bit about it. But we're living in a time now where you have Jews who have no clue what it's about. Really no clue. So, they have no opinion. They just don't know. It doesn't mean anything to them. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is what? I'm sorry, Hollywood. Actually, the people who set up Hollywood knew about a little bit about Judaism because that's the previous generation, like Meyer from Metro Goldwyn Mayer. These people, they actually knew something. The ones today know. Yeah, but originally Jews set up Hollywood, but today they're just a part of it. They're not. They don't run it anymore. But when Jews ran Hollywood during the war, they made movies for the American soldiers totally free for the government. And then during the McCarthy era, they were blamed that they're communists. Same people who made the movies for the. Okay, so we talk about the political parties in Israel and try to explain how the political parties are representing these various groups, and then I'm going to talk about the problem, which I think is one of the main problems we have in Israel today, aside from what I mentioned before, which is the fact that there are Jews from so many cultures and so many countries. Because the cultures, by the second and the third generation, definitely by the third generation, people get used to it. If once upon a time an Ashkenazic Jew, a European Jew living in Israel, would never eat kubit, which is an Iraqi type of food, and there's even kubit soup, right? And then it could be red or green soup. So would never happen. They didn't even eat hummus and tchina, nothing. Okay, because that's the other guys do that. Today, who would even think that way? Everybody eats everything. It's like the separation is marginal today. The inter-ethnic marriage in Israel between the various groups, very high, 30 to 40%, at least 40% at this point. Meaning it doesn't matter that much to people. Maybe it mattered to certain generations, but it's breaking down. So as far as that goes, the message is good, which means what many people were not sure would work is working. So that part is the Israeli melting pot is working, even though it had problems. I'm not saying it did not. You had in the 50s. Remember, Israel was controlled. Oh, we'll talk about the political parties. You have it right in front of you. I'm running it from left to right, and then I put the Arabs at the bottom. But it's not exactly. Originally, you had the Labor Party. The Labor Party, the first leader was David Ben-Gurion. They were also, of course, in the Jewish Agency. The Labor Party was made up of two parties, two labor parties. One of them was called Mifleget Poalei Yisrael, Mapai, which was actually David Ben-Gurion's party. It was the larger of the two. And you had a smaller one, Mifleget Poalim Meuchadim, the United Workers. One of the Israeli Workers' Party, United. The Mapam, the United Workers' Party, was more communist than the Mapai, which was more socialist. But actually, David Ben-Gurion was a deep believer in communism. He wanted the whole country to work like the Israeli health system, which works from the top down, something like that. He wanted the whole country to be like it because he was a big believer in it. But anyhow, so the Labor Party was Mapai Mapam. Then you had, and the party which was, you might say at the time, which existed simultaneously was the Cherut, which eventually becomes the Likud. The Cherut is the party of Menachem Begin. Now, the difference between the Labor and the Cherut. The Labor Party is a socialist party. It's a Jewish socialist party, but because it's socialist, they are secular, right? Communists and socialists are secular. Hi, welcome. Remind me again of your name. I'll just write you down on the list. Yes. Okay, so when I'm explaining how to, so you have here on the one hand the Labor Party, and you have a root. The root becomes really cool. They join in with another, which eventually disappears. So Israel starts off as a democracy. But the strange thing about the democracy of Israel is that it's a democracy which is made up of people who in their lives never saw democracy. They came from Russia, they came from Poland, they came from Romania, they came from Hungary, they came from Lithuania. Take the ones from the Arab countries. None of them ever saw democracy. So it was an idea. They wanted to be a democracy, but it was an idea. On the other hand, the price you have to pay for a democracy is that maybe somebody else to take over. Okay. Now, the Labor Party saw itself as the one who should run the country. They were mostly Ashkenazic Jews, like 99%. Mostly secular Jews, like 96%. And they felt that we should be the ones running the country because we were the ones who came in 1904 and 1905. And we were the ideologues, and all these guys, these other guys are just coming here because they have nowhere to go. I'm making it very banal and simplistic, but there were people who thought this way. Ben-Gurion was actually a big believer in the people. And he also believed in getting everybody involved in everything. But there were other people under him who were more narrow-minded. and really thought that they wanted to create an elite. And the proof is in the pudding. There was only one party for 30 years. That's not exactly a democracy. Democracy, there's supposed to sometimes be another party in the government. So how did it happen in 1948 till 1977? There was only one party because the people in that party were running all the institutions because they set up the institutions. They were running the courts and they were running the media and they ran everything. Because you're the government, you set everything up, you put the people you wanted to be in it, and so it was easy. I don't blame anybody by that. I understand it. You just started off. It's very hard for a new country to start off as the democracy. What if the people vote for somebody who's no good? It's a luxury you don't always have. You know, in Israel, even today in Israel, if we put somebody at the top who has no idea about security, we're in a big problem because we had that under Ehud Olmert, who knew nothing about security. It's a good thing that the IDF knew something about security at the time. But the Minister of Defense was this guy Peretz, Amir Peretz, who knew nothing about security. So if you go all the way to the beginning, if you have people, you know, who don't know what to do for security, the whole government could come apart. I understand. I'm just saying that it's very hard to work as a democracy when your goal is to keep certain people in power. But I understand it, 100%. I actually like Ben Gurion. But I'm just saying that as a Democrat, there is a problem here. What happened? Now, Ben Gurion hated for many years. He and Begin did not get along. What were the main differences between the two parties? Labor was a socialist party. As I said, Mapam was their even more socialist side to it. Herut, or the Likud, was free market capitalists. But the truth is, both of them were secularists. And both of them came from Eastern Europe. Vladimir Jabotinsky was the ideologue of the Herut Likud party. He also came from the same places that David Ben-Gurion came from. So they were enemies, but they understood each other 100%. They were Ashkenazic Jews who grew up in families where they spoke Yiddish. They became secularists, but they all understood each other, even if they were at each other's necks, theoretically, in politics, but they definitely understood each other. Now, even in the first government, the labor did not have a majority, or they didn't have a strong majority. So right away, they asked other groups to join in. The religious parties at that time, at the first Knesset in 1948, there was only one. It was called the National Religious Party, the Mizrahi. The letter was Bet. And just to understand, the Labor Party, their letter was Aleph, which is the first letter. The religious party, their letter was Bet. This was not by mistake. Ben Gurion understood, if I can get together with the religious party, I'll have a solid majority. And since the religious don't care so much about socialism and capitalism, they just care more about religion, it'll be okay. So it was actually his choice to take the religious parties together. So all these people who talk about, oh, the religious parties right from the beginning, they push this, push that, it's just not true. Well, we have in Israel what's called the status quo. The status quo means that whatever was during the British Mandate continued under the state of Israel. For instance, marriage and divorce is under the rabbinate if you're Jewish. Marriage and divorce is under the church if you're Christian. Marriage and divorce is under the Qadi, meaning the mosque if you're Muslim. That's the way it works in Israel, meaning religious law for marriage and divorce. But that's the way it was under the British Mandate. That was called keeping the status quo. Another thing, in Israel, there were no buses on the Sabbath under the British Mandate, except for the city of Haifa. That's the way it continued after. Stores were closed on Shabbat under the British Mandate. Same thing. Okay, so Ben Gurion was able to solve a problem. We'll just keep the status quo. And if people ask me why, I'll say because we need the religious. He didn't have a problem with it personally. But at least by having the religious, and it makes them feel good, they're in our government, instead of having 50 seats in the Knesset, we now have 65, 70, right? He probably even had more of the first one. The Herut, the Likud was very tiny at first. They started in 1948 maybe with 8 seats in the Knesset. They grew to over the years about 15. They were never a very large party, but they were a significant part of the opposition. There also was not a lot of opposition parties. They had all these little splinter groups in Israel at the time. So this goes on till 1977, and the religious parties are always together with the labor till 1977 too. Okay, you have the Labor Party, you have the religious Zionists, and then eventually Agudat Yisrael, which is on the list here, which was the Ashkenazic ultra-Orthodox party, who eventually joined the Knesset because they realized if you want money for your institutions, you can't just leave it up to the religious Zionists, right? So what they did was they got their own party into. And so they also worked together with the labor, and the labor made sure that their institutions had money. And they also made deals saying that we want a certain amount of our people studying yeshiva not to go to the army. And Ben Gurion was okay with that. All these issues that have come up today, it didn't start from today. They all started from 1948 till 1977. This went on and on. This was at the beginning. And when you tell people that today, they'll say, okay, there was different times, there was less. Yeah, but the whole country was small. So obviously there are more today when you have 9.7 million people. So, but it's the same thing. All the people in the opposition today were saying, how come you're letting these ultra-Orthodox not go to the army? If they were in the government, they would do the same thing. Because they don't want to fight with them. Can these things be solved? Yes. But you don't solve things by punching somebody in the face. You solve them by talking. But it's very easy to solve. Because if you understand the ultra-Orthodox world and the way it works, it has problems, but it doesn't like doing its dirty laundry in the public. But people understand it, know the problems that they're having. Let me just put that aside for a moment. So if you look on the list, I just explained the Labor Party. I explained the Cherut. The difference between them until 1967, the only difference was one of them was socialist and one of them was non-socialist. That was the main difference. The National Religious, also, the difference was that they were religious and the other guys were all secular. The Labor and the Cherut, they were all secularists. They weren't anti-religion. Maybe the Mapam Islam was slightly anti-religious because it was for diehard, more closer to communism. But most of the others didn't have a problem. You know, you have to have a day of rest. It's going to be on Saturday instead of Sunday or Friday. So what? I mean, what's the big deal? So most of them did not have a problem with that. Closing stores, they have to have a day off anyhow. So, you know, people always say the buses should run on Shabbat. I say, and the bus drivers are not allowed to have a day off. You want them to take off on Tuesday instead? Is that better? You know, it's like people don't think these things through. Okay. Now what happens? Those were the original parties. There were different ones, but they don't exist today. 1967, everything sort of changes in Israel. If you remember, there's a 6-day war. Israel takes over the West Bank and Gaza, and all of a sudden, instead of having 600,000 Arabs living in Israel, it's now well over 1 million, somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million. Remember, there weren't a lot of people in these areas at that time. They actually grew under Israel's quote unquote apartheid occupation. Okay, they doubled in numbers since 1967. Yeah, it's probably the only place in the world where they blame you for apartheid and everybody wants to come in. You have Arabs marrying into families on purpose who live in Israel to get Israeli citizenship. You know, normally in Arab culture, the woman follows the man. The man lives in Kuwait, you go to Kuwait. But when it's Israel, they both go to Israel. Doesn't matter if the man was from Israel, the woman from Israel, they all come to Israel. They all want to be in Israel. That's the point. So, because they know it's a much easier place to get along, even if you're Muslim. Okay, so 1967, what happens like this? Let me explain. The Labor Party and the Likud at the time until 1967, there was no difference between them in their understanding of Zionism. Absolutely no difference. Okay, the Cherut which became the Likud, used to play around, say, both sides of the Jordan belong to us, even Transjordan, but they never did anything about it. So it was just talk is cheap. They used to say it was wrong that the British gave Transjordan to the Hussein family. Okay, but it happened. So what are you going to do about it? Nothing. But that was one of their slogans. Okay, so they were as if the right wing. But I say as if. We have an expression in 1967. I'm in the middle of a class. I'll get back to you. Okay, thank you. There's an expression in Israel when they talk about the right wing. It's called Eretz Yisrael Hashlema, those who want the complete land of Israel. This term, the complete land of Israel, meaning the West Bank and Gaza, this term was coined by Natan Alterman, who was an ideologue for the Labor Party. He was the one who used the term the first time after the 6 Day War. Natan Alterman wrote a lot of poetry. Natan Alterman. Yes, he was a poet. Some of his songs were sung by Naomi Shemer. And he was an ideologue of the Labor Party. He was the one who coined the term. And the Labor Party believed that, the Labor Party of Golda Meir, for sure, believed that the West Bank was Israel, that the Golan was Israel, that Gaza was Israel. The only question was, do we have the political ability to hold on to it? That was the question. Nothing more. Okay, when do you want to take a break? No, anybody. Do you want to take a 5-minute break or something like that, or do we just keep going? So let's take a break. Okay, so it's now 6:30. So I'm going to close this recording, and